Well, I will preface my paper tonight with just a handful of comments. First of all, you don't need to worry about how long we're going to go tonight. This is a formal paper that I'm actually going to read, but it was written as a debate position for a student debate organization at Oregon State called the Socratic Society. And the question that my opponent and I agreed to debate that night was as follows: is Christianity conducive to doing good science? Okay. So it's changed a little bit from that position that I presented. It's about 5 minutes longer. On that occasion, I was strictly limited to 20 minutes. And I came in right as the hammer was coming down. And it's not more than 5 minutes longer at this point. So you don't have to worry about taking the whole evening and getting antsy. But in a formal red paper, it's easy to get antsy, especially if you go an hour. So I'm aware of that, but this isn't as long as you might fear. The second thing is that that will leave us a lot of the time when this is done to talk about anything in here or anything that I said Monday night. Or if anyone was here last night, when I come back to something there, that's fine. But as you saw last night, quite a few of those questions weren't really in my alley, and I just punted them. Things about biblical literature in terms of like biblical manuscripts and stuff like that. I don't know anything about biblical manuscripts. So it's and then finally, I do represent. I do write regularly for Biologos, which is known for a certain view of origins, in which there's a general acceptance of biological evolution. Now, it's been said many, many times in my presence that proponents of what's often called theistic evolution or evolutionary creation don't believe in doing natural theology. They weren't here tonight. So, you hear what you hear. I do it differently than people did, like William Paley did, or than Bill Dembski does, or that anyone else around there does. I do it differently, but this actually is natural theology that you're about to hear tonight. So take it for what it's worth. It's a different kind of natural theology than what William Paley did. I don't think his kind is viable any longer, but I think other kinds are. So, sadly, the public conversation about religion and science today is often dominated by shrill, uninformed voices who demonize and insult their opponents, marginalize alternative views in an effort to polarize, and bend the truth until it breaks. We can do a lot better than that. As an historian of science with particular expertise in science and religion, I have a different view of this than many other commentators. Although the historical landscape is not entirely absent of conflicts involving religion and science, the general picture is substantially unlike the popular conception of ongoing inevitable conflict that is promoted by certain preachers of atheism. Quite the opposite. I will argue that Christian faith often complements the picture of the world coming from the sciences, helping us to achieve a deeper understanding of both the way the world is and how we should go about understanding it, while providing a powerful motive for investigating nature. The Christian doctrine of creation helps us to understand more of reality than science alone can study, including the very possibility of science itself as a form of knowledge about nature. The tone of my position is no less important than the content. I'm not trying to show that every open-minded, well-informed, rational person must draw the same conclusions that I draw. There are no slam dunk answers to jump shot questions, and questions about the existence of God, the intelligibility of nature, or the meaning of life are of just that sort. The enormous success of science in explaining so many features of the natural world is partly a result of limiting its method and scope to things that can be measured and tested against nature, deliberately leaving all other matters to one side, but not debunking these matters as meaningless. Now, Richard Dawkins vehemently disagrees with the point I just made. When he asked himself, what is the meaning of life? This was his answer. If science has nothing to say, it's certain that no other discipline can say anything at all. That was a prominent public pronouncement. He said that at the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures in London in 1991. That was the tradition begun by people like Humphrey Davy and Michael Faraday in the 19th century. Large public lectures about science. The arrogance of such a claim, dismissing in 17 words the significance of all art, music, literature, and everything else that any person has ever thought about the question, apart from science, is staggering. However, Dawkins doesn't really speak for the whole scientific community when he says such things. He speaks only for himself and those who happen to agree with him. A different opinion comes from the late Peter Medawar, a Nobel laureate biologist who, like Dawkins, did not believe in God. The existence of a limit to science is made clear by its inability to answer childlike questions having to do with first and last things. Questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? It is not to science, therefore, but to metaphysics, imaginative literature, or religion, that we must turn for answers to questions having to do with first and last things. It is to a few of those first and last things that I now turn. I'll start with a famous statement from the greatest scientist of the last century, Albert Einstein. The most incomprehensible thing about the world is that it is comprehensible. He was referring implicitly to two different aspects of nature: its regularity and the fact that our minds can delve deeply into it, producing a coherent picture of reality. Both are prerequisites for the very possibility of doing science, and they happen to match perfectly the biblical notion of creation. Now, what exactly do I mean by creation? An idea that might easily be misunderstood if I don't spell it out. Christopher Kaiser, a Harvard-trained astrophysicist and theologian, puts it like this. The basic idea of creation in Scripture is that the entire universe is subject to a code of law which was established at the beginning of time. This idea has two major implications for our view of the world. One, nature functions with a high degree of autonomy, meaning literally having its own laws. And two, the natural world is comprehended by God, and therefore comprehensible to human beings created in the divine image. Now, I lack time to expand on Kaiser's claim with specific passages from the Bible and the great theologians. Suffice it to say that the term lex naturae, Latin for law of nature, appears very early in Christian thought. Now, when I read this just a few days ago, just on Tuesday at St. Tommy's, I said this, and I'm going to correct myself. I'll tell you what I told them. I spent a day in the library at Luther today, so I'm going to make a correction. When I said suffice to say that the term lex naturae appears very early in Christian thought, no later than the 4th century, when Ambrose used it in his Latin paraphrase of the Hexameron by Basil of Caesarea. I know there's earlier cases than that. So technically that's not incorrect, but there's earlier cases. I won't bother you with them tonight. Christian theologians made the concept commonplace long before scientists picked up the term, precisely because it has such strong theological overtones. Philosopher of science Nancy Cartwright, a prominent atheist, has even recommended that scientists stop using the language and concept of laws of nature altogether. Without God, there cannot be laws of nature, nor anything else with their crucial characteristics, she has said. I agree with her. Cartwright's conclusion flatly contradicts a widely publicized claim made by astrophysicist Lawrence Krauss, a self-described anti-theist. According to Krauss, advances in cosmology and particle physics have made it clear that there's a plausible case for understanding precisely how a universe full of stuff, like the universe we live in, could result literally from nothing by natural processes. And therefore, we don't need a creator. Frankly, this is all bluster. Krauss's pronouncement goes far beyond science, immersing him in philosophical and theological waters that are much deeper than he realizes. David Albert, an atheistic philosopher of physics at Columbia, deftly exposed Krauss's astonishing naivete in the New York Times, concluding that none of Krauss's ideas amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of a creation from nothing. Physicist Paul Davies is equally unimpressed by claims of this sort. It is all very well proclaiming that the laws of physics plus the initial cosmic conditions explain the universe. But this begs the question of where those laws and conditions came from in the first place. Science may be powerfully successful in explaining the universe, but how do we explain science? Why does science, based on the notion of external laws of physics, work and work so well? Many of those natural laws are expressed mathematically. The great astronomer James Jeans once said that as our knowledge advanced, the universe begins to look more like a great thought than like a great machine. This feature of the universe also has strong theological overtones, leading countless Jewish and Christian scientists to quote a creation text from the Book of Wisdom, which is, of course, is not in the Protestant or Jewish canon, but is in the Catholic canon. And I might say that my hunch is, this isn't something I'm prepared to, make a big argument for, but my hunch is that that this might be the most widely quoted biblical literature text on the part of scientists historically, this particular text. Thou hast ordered all things in measure and number and weight. It is not simply the fact that the universe can be understood. Something else even more remarkable is going on here with mathematics, something about how we understand it. Many years ago, Nobel laureate Eugene Wigner wrote a famous paper with a fascinating title, and I bet if I asked for a show of hands, several people in the room will know this paper. It's called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences, about 1960, I think. The enormous usefulness of mathematics in the natural sciences is something bordering on the mysterious, and there's no rational explanation for it. With mathematics, we can probe very deeply into matter and far out into the universe in ways that are completely unanticipated and yet incredibly accurate. Wigner puts it like this: the mathematical formulation of the physicist's often crude experience leads, in an uncanny number of cases, to an amazingly accurate description of a large class of phenomena. This shows that the mathematical language has more to commend it than being the only language we can speak. It shows that it is, in a very real sense, the correct language. The director of the SETI project, astronomer Seth Shostak, for whom I worked as an intern some 45 years ago, you can ask me about that afterward. Shostak does not believe in God. However, as cosmologist John Barrow has noted, the whole SETI project assumes that mathematics is a universal language. Carl Sagan obviously thought so, judging from his novel Contact, in which extraterrestrial beings make their presence known to us by using the prime number sequence. This could only be possible if mathematics is the same at other times as well as in other places. So the seemingly universal presence of mathematics in nature is a profound fact about our encounter with the universe, and it cries out for a deeper explanation. If mathematics is merely a human invention, and our minds are nothing more than the product of a blind evolutionary process that guarantees only our survival, not the truth of our mathematical propositions, then why do our equations describe nature so well? As Paul Davies has observed, survival depends on an appreciation of how the world is, not of any underlying hidden order. Certainly, it cannot depend on the hidden order within atomic nuclei, or in black holes, or in subatomic particles that are produced on Earth only inside particle accelerator machines. All of this suggests that mathematics has some element of transcendence about it, suggesting in turn the possibility of a transcendent cause, of the match between mathematics and matter. Is it perhaps the case, as Jeans, Kepler, Galileo, and Copernicus believed, that God is a mathematician? I'm with John Polkinghorne on this. He says there is no a priori reason why beautiful equations should prove to be the clue to understanding nature, why fundamental physics should be possible, why our minds should have such ready access to the deep structure of the universe. It is a contingent fact that this is true of us and our world, but it does not seem entirely sufficient simply to regard it as a happy accident. Surely it is a significant insight into the nature of reality. Whether they are mathematical or not, scientific laws summarize an enormous body of observations, giving them conceptual shape, while helping us to predict the results of future observations. They arise out of the interplay of reason and experience that lies at the heart of modern science. Although few scientists today are aware of it, there are actually deep connections between theism and the idea that we ought to learn about nature first and foremost by observing it. Living at a time when we're confronted with enormously speculative claims about an inconceivable number of undetectable universes, it's worth remembering something that Galileo's spokesman Salviati said to Simplicio in his famous book about the Copernican system, in which there are three interlocutors who banter topics about. The man who speaks for Galileo, Salviati, says this: "Our discourses must relate to the sensible world and not to one on paper." In our own day, the great cosmologist George Ellis has said exactly the same thing in response to Sean Carroll's recommendation that we should accept the multiverse hypothesis even without being able to test it empirically. As Ellis points out, Carroll is basically saying that the rules for doing good science have changed. This is moving the goalposts. Instead of belief in a scientific theory increasing when observational evidence arises to support it, he, by which he means Carroll suggests that theoretical discoveries alone bolster belief. But conclusions arising logically from mathematics need not apply to the real world. Experiments have proved many beautiful and simple theories wrong. Now, one vestige of the theology underlying the modern scientific attitude is the presence in most scientific papers of the two words facts, F-A-C-T-S, and data, D-A-T-A. They come from Latin words meaning made and given, silently reminding us that the facts pertain to the things that God has made, and that data are given to us by the author of nature. To take this further, I call on Alexander Koyré, a Jewish scholar of great erudition, whose influence on the history of science in the last century was nothing short of profound. Reflecting insightfully on the foundational concepts underlying Newton's science, Koyré said this: "As we see, empiricism and metaphysics, even a very definite kind of metaphysics, the creationist, are closely linked together. What other means, indeed, but observation and experience can we possibly use for the study of a world freely created by an infinite God?" Now, during the scientific revolution, that's the Copernicus through Newton period, more or less, a great debate took place between the empiricists and the rationalists, with a crucial theological component. The rationalists, such as René Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, and Gottfried Leibniz, held that reason alone was sufficient to discover the fundamental laws of nature. In fact, in the 18th century, some great mathematicians thought that Newton's laws were a priori truths, just like Euclid's axioms. The empiricists, including Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, and Isaac Newton, held that science could not be done in an armchair. Observation and experiment were essential components. Now, this irreducible difference of opinion shines through in something that Leibniz told Christian Huygens. "Mr. Boyle spends far too much time, to be truthful, drawing from an infinity of splendid experiments no other conclusions than those which he could have taken for principles of nature, which one can certify to be true from reason alone, whereas experiments, no matter how numerous, cannot prove them." Now, what did Christian theology have to do with this debate about how science should be done? Well, consider what the ancient physician Galen had written when he was comparing the Greek notion of God and creation to that of the Hebrews in the Bible. "Our own opinion and that of Plato and of the other Greeks who follow the right method in natural science differs from the position taken up by Moses. For Moses, it seems enough to say that God simply willed the arrangement of matter, and it was presently arranged in due order. For he believes everything to be possible with God. We Greeks, however, do not hold this. We say that certain things are impossible by nature, and that God does not even attempt such things, but that he only chooses the best out of the possibilities of becoming. In other words, Moses' God is free to do things outside of the box in which Galen and the Greeks put their gods. In exactly the same way, the rationalists of Boyles' day felt that the author of nature would never write surprise endings. Well, listen to these words from the preface to Newton's famous book, The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. That is the background to all the Newtonian physics that's still taught today. The business of true philosophy is to derive the natures of things from causes truly existent, and to inquire after those laws on which the great Creator actually chose to found this most beautiful frame of the world, not those by which he might have done the same, had he so pleased. Anyone presumptuous enough to think that he can learn the laws of nature from pure reason must either suppose that the world exists by necessity, and by the same necessity follows the laws proposed, or, if the order of nature was established by the will of God, that himself, a miserable reptile, can tell what was fittest to be done. Robert Boyle, who helped create the modern laboratory and its methods, said exactly the same thing. For if we believe God to be the author of things, it is rational to conceive that he may have made them commensurate rather to his own designs in them than to the notions we men may best be able to frame of them. The author of nature consulted not in the production of things with human capacities, but first made things in such manner as he was pleased to think fit, and afterward left human understandings to speculate as well as they could. Another example comes from Michael Faraday, one of the most important scientists who's ever lived, and one of the most intensely religious. The late Cornell University historian L. Pierce Williams wrote the standard scientific biography of Faraday. Although Williams was an unapologetic atheist with whom I had a few conversations, he notes with admiration how Faraday drew more than strength from his religion. It gave him both a sense of the necessary unity of the universe, derived from the unity and benevolence of its creator, and a profound sense of the fallibility of man. Both are worth stressing. The origins of field theory are to be found in Faraday's detailed experimental researches in electricity, but the speculations and imaginings which led him to publish physical heresies owe something to his unquestioning belief in the unity and interconnectedness of all phenomena. This belief, in turn, derived from his faith in God as both creator and sustainer of the universe. As with each of these examples, for centuries, Christian theology has been closely linked with a humble attitude toward human knowledge and a genuine openness to finding wholly unanticipated, even seemingly irrational things in nature. And this is surely conducive to doing good science. Indeed, we have an identical opinion for none other than Thomas Henry Huxley, famously known as Darwin's bulldog for his eagerness to defend Darwin's theory of evolution when it was still a brand new idea in the mid-19th century. Huxley was no Christian. He coined the word agnostic to describe his own position. But he understood that science and Christianity have at least this in common. Science seems to me to teach in the highest and strongest manner the great truth which is embodied in the Christian conception of entire surrender to the will of God. Sit down before fact as a little child. Be prepared to give up every preconceived notion. Follow humbly wherever and to whatever abysses nature leads, or you shall learn nothing. The relevance of the Christian understanding of creation for doing science should now be evident. But I will conclude with a complementary observation. Doing science actually enhances the Christian life, making one a better disciple of Jesus Christ. Hear Boyle's palpable excitement in this passage about the telescope. Though heaven be an object, that has been perpetually and conspicuously opposed to man's view and curiosity for some thousands of years. Yet it still affords new subjects for their wonder. And I scarce doubt that by the farther improvement of telescopes, posterity will have its curiosity gratified by the discovery both of new constellations and of new stars in those that are known to us already. We need not therefore fear that our admiration of God should expire for want of objects fit to keep it up. That boundless ocean contains a variety of excellent objects that is as little to be exhausted as the creatures that live on our sublunary ocean or lie on the shores that limit it can be numbered. Yet this pales in comparison with the sheer rapture that fills Kepler's works from cover to cover. For it is precisely the universe which is that book of nature, in which God the Creator has revealed and depicted his essence and what he wills with man in a wordless script. Or as he said on another occasion, writing to a fellow astronomer, you'd say today an amateur astronomer, who was the Chancellor of Bavaria, a Catholic official. Kepler was a Lutheran, but this man tried to persuade Kepler to come over to the good side from his point of view. Since we astronomers are priests of the Most High God with respect to the book of nature, it behooves us that we do not aim at the glory of our own spirit, but above everything else at the glory of God. Christianity encourages scientists to seek the glory of God and the charitable service of our fellow human beings, rather than self-aggrandizement, an ever-present danger for top scientists. As Boyle realized, the higher degree of knowledge that the scientist attains seems more likely to puff him up than to make him humble. And he noted how the challenges of laboratory life could teach one humility instead. This reminds me of Francis Bacon's famous advice that the book of God's Word and the book of God's Word, namely, that we should endeavor an endless progress or proficience in both. Only let men beware that they apply both to charity and not to swelling, to use and not to ostentation. And that passage, I think, it puts to lie the claims that Bacon is simply nothing but about power. He's about power to understand nature in the service, charitable service of humankind. I close with Boyle's advice to other scientists. In an age when so many allow differences of opinion to degenerate into vulgar name-calling, railing at a man's person or wrangling about his words is a quarrelsome and injurious way of writing that does very much misbecome both a philosopher and a Christian. Thank you for listening to those remarks.
All right, so we're going to have quite a bit of time for conversation as a way to wrap up this talk, but also the wider series. So we invite questions coming out of this, but also from the other evenings that we've had. But I thought I would take advantage of this opportunity as moderator to ask a few questions to get us started. So thank you, Ted, so much for the talk.
You're welcome.
On Tuesday night, again, for those that were here, we heard a talk that I think took apart the sort of inevitable conflict thesis and argued that it was just simply not historically tenable. I think you showed how the idea that Christianity and science are locked in this enduring conflict was, in its most influential form, a piece of propaganda, and demonstrated that. I think of sort of another account, a very different account of Christianity and science that argues, that Christians sometimes put forward, that argues that Christianity inevitably leads to modern science. And so it's also rejecting the conflict thesis, but it's putting a different narrative in its place. I don't take that to be what you're arguing here, but I wonder if you would comment on how what you're arguing here relates to that sort of narrative of Christianity leading inevitably to science.
Sure. The question I was investigating, as I explained to the group at the start, was really, is Christianity good for science, basically? It was not, that was more of a philosophical and even contemporary question. The other question that you've alluded to would be, did Christianity cause science? That's a very different question. I didn't really address that here, and I wouldn't want anyone to take the implication from this that I think that's the case.
Mhm.
I do not. There's many different forms that takes that we could just go on and without end tonight and describe what they are. I mean, there's, in short version, there's a Protestant form of that, according to which modern science emerges in the Reformation. That would be more like what Peter Harrison thinks is something like that is true. Or there's the Roman Catholic form that says that a lot of it had to do with the condemnation of 1277 in the medieval universities at Paris, and the encouragement to think outside the Aristotelian box. That's associated with people like Pierre Duhem, or in the 19th century, or Stanley Yaki in the 20th century. My own view is this. I'll quote the first sentence of the second chapter of a book I'm writing. Some of you guys, the books here, are reading the first chapter for an event tomorrow. The second chapter is about Christianity and Greek natural philosophy. And the first sentence says, Christianity was born into a world in which science already existed. Last night I spoke to that. I pointed out, just for example, I won't give the details this time, that by the 2nd century before Christ, the Greeks knew not only the size and shape of the earth, but they knew the size and distance to the moon. They knew how big the moon is and how far away it is. And their method was just as good for finding the size and distance to the sun. The reason it didn't give a very good number for that one is simply because it's really hard to calculate to do one particular measurement precisely enough in which the tangent of an angle almost 90 degrees is involved. And if you know anything about tangents, you know that if the angle is just a tiny fraction of a degree different, the tangent is enormously different. And so that's why their number really wasn't very good for that. But it would have been, had they been able to measure it better. So that's an immense achievement, really astonishing. But at that point in time, they did this. They weren't just piddling around. I think that's genuine science. And there's more examples of that before Jesus is born. So I'm not of the school that thinks that there wasn't any science, any genuine science in the ancient world. I think there was. And I think the reasons it kind of peters out don't really have anything to do with Christianity at all. It has to do with cultural conditions in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries in both halves of the Roman world, the Greek half and the Latin half, different things going on there. But so I don't think that's the case. But I do think it is the case that modern science of the early modern period, 16th, 17th centuries, is put together almost entirely by Christians, many of whom are quite devout, others are not. They don't see this as challenging to the faith that they have, and they see many points of contact and consonance. So certainly that much is true. Beyond this, I've already suggested some ways in which their beliefs at the time, theological debates about human knowledge and God, had something to do with favoring what we call rational empiricism. Rational empiricism is the name that a historian named Ryer-Woodcock gave to describe what the scientific method is about. Theologian Tom Torrance has spoken about the creation itself as a contingent order. And if we're going to understand a contingent order, a combination of reason and experience is needed. And that sort of thinking, in my view, is highly consistent with even more than that. It strongly supports the whole scientific enterprise itself and explains, at a metaphysical level, it explains why a certain kind of science is going to be the most successful. And it also, in my view, also explains things about the contingency of the universe itself and its components, which I think are evident to us, at least evident to me and many others, from the more we know about cosmology, the more that seems to be the case, that the universe is contingent and that its properties do not follow from pure reason, that we really do have to go out and find out how it actually is. A lot of choice was involved. As Einstein once said, what I really want to know is whether God had any choice when he made the universe. And that question is along those lines. So a long answer, but that's what I would say for that.
Just as a follow-up on that, so this is the first time I think I've heard the term rational empiricism, and I'm putting together pieces of your talk. It seems like the mathematical beauty of the universe and the fact that the universe sort of maps onto our equations most of the time points. Would you say that that's the rational side, and the empiricism side is coming out of that fact that the universe is given to us? We have to go out and discover what it is, but it's the combination of those two?
Yes, it is.
Because I heard both of those pieces in the talk, and they seem to be a little bit, to me they felt a little bit at odds, in the sense that the one is saying the universe is like a beautiful equation, and yet we can't just, from our minds and from pure mathematics, discover its reality.
We
Would
can
you say
find
that-
many, as George Ellis points out in
Mhm.
that quote I had, you can find many kinds of consistent mathematics,
Mhm.
beautiful mathematics that
Mhm.
don't
That
describe
don't-
physical reality.
Okay.
So the question is, which ones do you need?
Mhm.
And even a strong rationalist as Descartes,
Mhm.
in the Discourse on Method, says that even though he believes the basic laws of nature are a priori, they're given to us as clear and distinct propositions by God. The details of how they work out in nature you have to figure out, because God could have done it in a variety of ways, as Descartes says. So that's that tension of rationalism and empiricism together. It isn't one or the other. It's a both and.
In the talk, you touched on, I think you started out with the quote by Dawkins and then the quote by Medawar, and these two very different views of what science can and can't answer. And what struck me was that Medawar recognizes limits to scientific inquiry, the kinds of things that science can address. I wonder if you could talk, in your own view, again, as a historian of science and not as sort of a philosopher of science, but what do you see as the proper limits of science, and where do you see that fitting into a Christian worldview? So what is the place, the domain of scientific inquiry for a Christian, and what sorts of things lie beyond the bounds of scientific inquiry, if that makes sense?
Well, I'm going to oversimplify it, and if people here think I'm drastically oversimplifying it, perhaps that's what people are looking for.
We can talk about that.
But I would suggest that we go back to Aristotle's 4 causes of things. Aristotle famously teaches that an object has 4 causes, all of them operative together. An example is a statue. The material of which the statue is made, whether it's clay or wood or stone, is a material cause. Without that, you don't get a statue. So it has something to do with that statue existing. The hands and tools of the sculptor, perhaps if the person is sculpting clay, it's only her fingers and her hands. They are her tools. But maybe there's a chisel, maybe there's and a hammer, maybe there's other tools, maybe there's a saw. Right? People making butter sculptures in the wintertime are using a different set of tools. So the tools, the hands and the tools are the efficient cause, or secondary causes that they're later called. The things which actually do the shaping, do the removing of extra pieces of material. The form the statue takes is the formal cause. In modern science, in my view, that's equivalent to the mathematical equations that might apply in a given field. The formal cause, because they're not material at all. And they're not actually causing things. They're describing the patterns that we find. And that would be a formal cause. And then finally, the final cause, or first cause, later called the first cause, which is the purpose of the statue, which will be involved in the other 3 things. So for example, if the statue is to be outside of a sports stadium, it might represent a famous moment in that stadium, or a famous player who was there. Or if it's outside of a government building, it might represent a famous president or senator from that country. And outside of an armory, it might represent a famous military person. So you would have the purpose of the statue would determine partly the other things, the materials, the form, etc. So, and in that way, the science doesn't exactly answer some of those questions. Do you have Donald Mackay here? I said you had a copy.
Yes.
Pull
Yeah.
for me. This is a really old book that some of the people in the room who are around my age, or at least willing to admit that they are, probably remember when this book was new. It's called The Clockwork Image. The author of the book is Donald M. Mackay. He pronounced it Mackay. He was a Scot. He's been gone for a long time now. I think he died in the late 80s, early 90s. Mackay has a passage in here that I might need a minute to find. Is this it? Yeah. Not quickly finding it, unfortunately. I'll have to describe it for you. he talks about an advertising sign in Piccadilly Circus. And the advertising sign in Piccadilly Circus has the message on it, bongo is good for you. We don't know what bongo is in context, he doesn't tell us. So bongo is good for you. And Mackay says that this is a great big jumble of wires and other electrical devices and gas and glass and so that a person who could build this and a person who could repair this has a certain kind of knowledge. And that's complete as far as it goes at the level of that knowledge. But that there's other kinds of information in that sign that the electrical engineer didn't come up with and doesn't study. And that's what it's about. Of course, bongo is good for you. That's also an explanation. Why it says that. There's an explanation for why it says that and where it's placed. But electrical engineering didn't have anything to do with that. And so there's different levels of explaining things in our analysis of the world. And certain kinds of science operate at their level, but don't operate at other levels. People who presume that the science at that one level can answer any question worth answering are simply begging the question of whether there are more questions that are worth answering that science isn't capable of giving us answers to. And for Dawkins, those other things aren't worth talking about. They're just figments of people's imagination. But I dare say there are things that are not just figments of people's imagination that the science at its own level does not give answers to. In the case of neuroscience, for example, I know Bill Newsom, who's a very prominent neuroscientist at Stanford. He told me that his pastor in his church likes to give this example of neuroscience and meaning. He speaks about Steven Pinker, the famous Harvard evolutionary psychologist, who doesn't think that mind really exists. And as Newsom relates it, the story goes like this: that Pinker writes books about how there is no such person as Steven Pinker, and then Pinker's publisher sends him checks with the name Steven Pinker on it. Pinker turns the check over, signs the name Steven Pinker on the back, and deposits it in the bank. Newsom's point being that, okay, you take a theoretical position that you don't really exist as an individual, act consistently with that. And that's really I think, on point about this. Neuroscience can explain many things, and it will probably explain more in 10 years than it does now. But to say that because neuroscience doesn't explain you as a mental entity doesn't mean that you do not exist. And so and have meaning and value and purpose. And those things go beyond the ability of neuroscience to account for at its own level, and doesn't mean that they're not real. So that's Newsom's example. He's a member of the National Academy of Sciences, so I assume he's not distorting the claims of people in his own field when he describes it that way.
One final question before we open it up here, and a really practical one. What do you see as at stake in how we tell this history of Christianity and science? So, full disclosure, I'm a historian by training. I find this topic I have very little scientific background, but I do have the historical background. I find it fascinating just because I find history fascinating. But for someone that's a non-historian, that's a non-scientist, what would you say in terms of why should they care about whether we get it right or wrong in terms of how Christianity and science have related over this 2,000-year history?
Well, one reason would be that in the current world, in fact, since the 19th century, the history of science, or what an individual says passes for it, has been used as a weapon with which to beat either religious people in general. That's what Richard Dawkins would like to do with anything at his disposal, beat down religious people in general, or beat down traditional Christians. The authors of the so-called conflict thesis were, by and large, people who believed in God in a more nebulous sense, in the sense in which traditional Christians do, but who were not at all, did not at all resonate with the traditional Christian story and Christian claims of truth from the Scripture. And so they saw conflict, many of them saw conflict between science and traditional Christianity. without seeing conflict between science and religion more broadly defined. Dawkins and the modern new atheists go further than the original authors of the conflict view. They direct it indiscriminately against all forms of religion, which Dawkins describes as a virus that needs to be eradicated. Whereas the founders of this conflict view would not have spoken that way about religion in general. They did feel that Christianity was a repressive force culturally, holding back progress perpetually and inevitably. And that's the nature of the conflict thesis in its original formation. So it's not about atheism in its original formation, although atheists today like to use it. It's about very liberal notions of religion, and religion amounting to the Sermon on the Mount, which certainly is good religion, and love of neighbor and love of God. But none of these claims about resurrected Jesus or Jesus dying for your sins or God in communion with humans through Scripture, none of those ideas would have been bought into by the founders of the conflict view.